I'm very pleased to introduce our talk this week, or this month, I suppose. Dr. Aerielle Allen is a postdoctoral fellow at New York University and receives her PhD from the University of Connecticut. Next year, she'll begin as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Tufts University. Her research broadly focuses on how both societally advantaged and disadvantaged group members perceive, cope, and respond to information about inequality. In today's talk, she'll be sharing her research on how perceptions of anti-Black racism diverge and how acknowledging such racism affects individuals' health and social change behaviors. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Aerielle Allen.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for extending this invitation for me to be able to share this virtual space with you. I know that the format for you all is to be able to ask your questions later in the talk, but if there at any point you need me to stop or redefine something or repeat something, just go ahead and let me know. We'll make that happen. So before I start, I do want to mention what my overarching goal is as a social psychologist. And really, it's to illuminate how racism and other isms impede the lives of marginalized groups, to better aid efforts geared towards reducing bias, ameliorating oppressive isms, and advancing equity. And in large part, I do this through my research program, which really centers around three core lines and questions. So first, a lot of my work explores the consequences of racism and other isms in terms of engagement in social change behaviors and health outcomes. And more recently, I've begun to explore how beliefs about racial and other social biases shape perceptions of inequity, as well as what do people know about racial inequities across various domains. And so central to this program of research has really been the experiences of Black Americans, where I examine Black individuals as both the targets of racism as well as the perceivers of their own injustice. I also examine how other racial ethnic group members perceive, understand, and respond to racism against Black people. And in today's talk, I want to present slices of my work from each of these core areas. Specifically, I'm going to discuss some of my work examining racism-related risk factors among Black Americans, that is, their beliefs around race-based medical mistrust and the direct consequences these beliefs have for Black Americans' health, such as medication beliefs and medication adherence. I'm going to discuss some work around individuals' belief systems regarding anti-Black racism and how these beliefs shape perceptions of present-day racism, both isolated and structural, as well as engagement in anti-racist activism. And I'll end discussing some recent work examining whether having a belief system around racism is associated with the factual knowledge that individuals have about the history of racism in the US. But first, where are we in terms of the reality of racism and racial inequities in America? So there's longstanding research documenting persistent racial disparities between Black and white Americans across multiple domains. Black men are more likely to be incarcerated compared to white men. Black women are 3 times more likely to die giving birth compared to white women. Collectively, Black Americans are more likely to experience poverty compared to white Americans. And Black Americans have an overall shorter life expectancy compared to their white counterparts. However, even in light of this objective reality, Black and white Americans continue to differ largely in terms of their subjective beliefs regarding the existence and severity of racial inequity. Overall, Black Americans are more likely to believe that racial inequities exist compared to white Americans. Specifically, Black Americans are more likely to believe that Black people are treated unfairly when dealing with police, in hiring, pay, and promotional practices within the workplace and economic advancement opportunities more broadly, when applying for loans and in home ownership, and when seeking health care compared to white Americans. Even more, Black Americans are also more likely to hold the belief that structural and systemic racism are obstacles to racial equity compared to white Americans. So there appears to be a clear disconnect between what people understand in terms of the reality of racism and racial inequity versus individuals' subjective perceptions and attitudes about racism and racial inequality in the US. And a lot of social psychological research attempts to address this disconnect by focusing on increasing people's awareness about the objective reality of racism and racial discrimination. So really what's happening here is that there's this idea, right, that with this knowledge, namely about the existence of racial inequality and racism, that people's subjective attitudes and perceptions will sort of converge to match objective reality. That is, I now know about the reality of racial inequities and therefore will acknowledge racial inequities more. Most recently, work around increasing knowledge has really centered around increasing knowledge of historical anti-Black racism in the US. And the findings from this work suggest and demonstrate a few things. That this knowledge of historical racism is greater among marginalized groups compared to advantaged groups. So Black Americans tend to possess this knowledge around anti-Black racism or the history of anti-Black racism to a greater degree compared to white Americans. That this knowledge deficit partially contributes to or can explain this Black-white racial gap in the acknowledgement of racism presently, and that having greater factual knowledge about racism increases individuals' tendencies to perceive contemporary incidents of racial bias as being indicative of racism. So while knowledge helps us to understand discrepancies in the acknowledgement of racism, there are some cautions to consider when focusing solely on increasing knowledge, namely about historical racism, in order to sort of change these subjective attitudes and perceptions. So one caution is that we know that most Americans do not know or have factual knowledge about the history of anti-Black racism in the US. So here's a quote taken from the Southern Poverty Law Center's report on teaching American slavery. Schools are not adequately teaching the history of American slavery. Educators are not sufficiently prepared to teach it. Textbooks do not have enough material about it. And as a result, students lack a basic knowledge of the important role it played in shaping the United States and the impact it continues to have on race relations in America. Now, given this quote is referring to K-12 education, particularly among high school students. But if you think about high school as a time when individuals are sort of exposed to content and information that they may not otherwise be unless they sort of purposely seek it out, then the statement is likely generalizable to a larger population. Another caution, given work on schemas, is that people don't just see facts as facts. Information in the world is filtered through people's own experiences, attitudes, and beliefs. And I'm interested in understanding what those beliefs are. So in one paper, I describe how individuals have a belief system around racism, specifically anti-Black racism, which I have since termed critical racism awareness. And I suggest that this belief system reflects an understanding of racial injustice as it relates to economic, social, political, and health inequities. And that the magnitude of this belief system is largely shaped by one's identity, namely whether an individual is marginalized based on race or privileged based on race. And that is because one's identity changes the amount of exposure they are likely to have around issues of race and racism. I also suggest that this belief system is shaped in part by one's own experiences and the experiences of similar others. And I argue that this belief system is tied to perceptions of present-day inequities and can shape attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So while knowledge, such as knowledge of the historical racism, is one avenue that can partially explain this disconnect, in my research, I suggest that how people come to understand perceptions of racism and incorporate this into a belief system that is then used to guide perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors is another. And I'm going to start off by showing you what I mean, discussing some of my work on how Black Americans' beliefs around racial bias can impact their health, focusing mainly on the concept of medical mistrust. So medical mistrust reflects the belief that the healthcare system, both in terms of interpersonal relationships between patient and providers, as well as an institution more broadly, is acting against one's best interest or well-being. And this mistrust is linked to a variety of poor health outcomes and behaviors, such as lower engagement in healthcare services broadly, from delayed and lapses in visits to less willingness to receive and take medications and vaccines. And while medical mistrust is present across racial lines, it is extremely common among racial ethnic minority group members. And there are many contributing factors to medical mistrust, such as having a personal bad experience with a doctor, witnessing someone else having a bad experience, or learning about unethical practices and biased treatment in the healthcare system. And now much of the public health research on medical mistrust, particularly among Black Americans, cites the Tuskegee syphilis study as the main catalyst. And I won't go into too much detail on what the background of the study is, given that I'm assuming most of you in this shared virtual space learned about it in your city training. But what I do want to note is that the consequences of this maltreatment extended beyond just these men involved directly in the study and affected entire Black communities. And this study is still considered one of the major factors that contributes to race-based health disparities, even though seen presently. which sort of begs the question whether for racial ethnic minorities, particularly Black Americans, there is likely an additional racialized component to medical mistrust that influences health outcomes differently than just general medical mistrust, which is what I explored in this study. So in this study, we examined the relationship between general medical mistrust and race-based medical mistrust on the health attitudes and behaviors of Black Americans living with HIV. Specifically, the implications mistrust has for medication concern beliefs, which really sort of reflects this apprehension towards taking one's medication and having sort of negative attitudes regarding the negative effects of taking one's medication. Medication necessity beliefs, which reflects sort of these beliefs around the benefits of taking one's medication. And we also examined medication adherence. So 458 Black men and women living with HIV were recruited from Atlanta, Georgia to participate in this study. And in order to participate in this survey, participants had to be 18 or older, English speaking, and had to present proof of an HIV positive status. Now, we didn't test them on site to see if they were HIV positive. So this really included participants either bringing in a prescription with their name on it that was for HIV related treatment, or bringing in test results that indicated an HIV positive status. So we had 4 different measures related to mistrust and trust in this study, but I'm going to focus primarily on the mistrust measures here. So we assessed general medical mistrust using items such as patients have sometimes been deceived or misled by healthcare providers. And these items did not have any sort of identity-related component. We also assessed race-based medical mistrust along 2 different dimensions, discrimination and suspicion. And so the discrimination subscale included items such as people of my race do not receive the same medical care from doctors and healthcare workers as people from other groups, which really sort of speaks directly to biased practices based on race. And the suspicion subscale included items such as people of my race cannot trust doctors and healthcare workers, which reflected a sort of distrust or skepticism based on race. And our outcome measures of interest included that medication concern beliefs, which again reflected a sort of apprehension towards taking one medication, and included items such as I sometimes worry about the long-term effects of my HIV medicines. Those medication necessity beliefs, which again reflected believing in the benefits of taking one's medication, and included items such as without my HIV medicines, I would be very ill. And we also assessed medication adherence, which we asked participants to indicate on a scale from 0 to 100, the percentage they had been adherent to their medication in the past month. And this item correlates really well with other objective measures of medication adherence, such as pill count, and in the case of HIV, viral load. So to start, what we really wanted to do was observe whether there was a relationship between general medical mistrust and those race-based medical mistrust measures. And if so, how strong was this relationship? And what we found was that there was a strong relationship between this general medical mistrust and this race-based medical mistrust among our Black participants. So if our Black participants had one form of medical mistrust, they likely had the other. Now, before proceeding to the next set of results, I do want to note that we tested a larger structural equation model predicting medication adherence, which I'm happy to talk about more if folks are interested at the end of the talk. But for now, I'm going to just present on the bivariate regressions that were used to really sort of assess the predictive relationship between those 2 measures of mistrust and our outcome measures of interest. So for the medication concern beliefs, what we found is that both general medical mistrust and race-based medical mistrust predicted medication concern beliefs. So having greater mistrust predicted increasing and having concerns about, yes? Was there, okay, thought I heard something. So the general medical mistrust predicted increase in the having concerns about or apprehensions towards taking one's medication. And this was true for those sort of non-identity related items, as well as those race-based items. For medication necessity beliefs, general medical mistrust did not predict beliefs regarding the benefits or the need for taking one's HIV medication. However, race-based medical mistrust did, such that the more race-based medical mistrust that individuals had, this predicted decreased beliefs regarding the need to take one's medication. And for medication adherence, we see a similar pattern. General medical mistrust did not predict medication adherence, but race-based medical mistrust did. So the more race-based medical mistrust that participants had, this predicted decreased HIV medication adherence. So the findings from this study really sort of demonstrate that Black Americans have both general and race-based medical mistrust that are predictive of health-related outcomes to varying degrees. So while both general and race-based medical mistrust predicted medication concern beliefs, only race-based medical mistrust, which is in part attributable to present as well as past and vicarious experiences with racism, predicted both medication necessity beliefs as well as medication adherence. Now, notably, I did not ask participants their knowledge about racism, historical or otherwise, nor did we directly assess their personal experiences with racism to see how that influenced medical mistrust generally or race-based medical mistrust more specifically. But given that race-based medical mistrust was predictive of medication beliefs and adherence, either to the same degree or even when general medical mistrust did not, suggests that people are not coming into contexts or environments with a blank slate. More so, there is something tied to one's identity that influences how they interpret and respond in a given context. And in this case, for Black Americans, something tied to their racial identity influenced their feelings of medical mistrust, which subsequently impacted their health outcomes. More broadly, this suggests that people have these belief systems that are tied to the identities that are relevant to them, namely their racial ethnic identities. And this impacts how they respond to issues and contexts around race. So in the context of beliefs about anti-Black racism, this belief system may be the result of aggregated experiences with racism, such as those directly experienced, those indirectly experienced collectively in the past, such as is the case with the Tuskegee syphilis study, as well as learned experiences such as racial socialization for family and friends. And this belief system is likely to influence the way that Black Americans view and respond to issues of race and racism. But given the prevalence of racism in society, white Americans likely have a belief system around racism too. And this is likely to be different in degree for white Americans compared to Black Americans because they have different experiences in terms of racism and racial socialization, which often occurs to a lesser degree among white Americans compared to their Black counterparts. So in this next study that I'm going to talk to you all about, I wanted to explore whether people have belief systems around anti-Black racism, and if they do, what are the social justice or social change implications of having such a belief system? So understanding a belief system around racism is still important because even though we already have concepts such as symbolic racism, which sort of assesses anti-Black affect and attitudes, as well as measures such as critical consciousness, which reflects individuals' beliefs about various disenfranchised groups in terms of their race, as well as their sexual orientation, gender, etc. And both of these are known to sort of predict perceptions of bias and discrimination, as well as engagement in social change efforts. Measures such as symbolic racism may not do as much as we'd like in terms of understanding how marginalized groups assess their own marginalization. And given work on attitudes and behaviors, we know that measures that are more explicitly tied to our outcomes or interests are better predictors. So a general measure of attitudes about inequality in various disenfranchised groups may not explain as much as we'd like in terms of understanding people's perceptions and behaviors around racism specifically anti-Black racism. So here I examined whether Black and white Americans have a belief system around anti-Black racism. And I assessed the effect of this belief system around anti-Black racism on perceptions of racism in the present and anti-racism activism relative to previous measures of symbolic racism and critical consciousness. So for this study, I recruited a little over 1,000 Black and white American participants from the University of Connecticut, Cal State Northridge, social media using a sort of snowball sampling technique, as well as through Qualtrics and prolific research panels. And in this cross-sectional survey, it included multiple items that I created to assess different aspects of beliefs around anti-Black racism, which I'll describe in more detail soon. But before I move on, I did want to note that I did not observe significant differences among the sources of participants. And so when I speak to the findings, I really am speaking to them at the racial ethnic group level and not any race by recruitment source interaction. So drawing from work on critical consciousness, African-American consciousness, as well as work around Black blame, meritocracy beliefs, structural inequity, and attribution theory, I created several items that resulted in 5 different belief dimensions around anti-Black racism based on factor analyses. So the first belief dimension was racism as endemic, which reflects the belief that anti-Black racism is culturally embedded and foundational to the US, as well as an acknowledgement of the similarities or the linkages between past and present forms of racial oppression and the continuity of historical racism. And this was assessed using items such as blaming racial inequality on things like Black family culture is a way to take the blame off the history of race discrimination. The second belief dimension was non-minimization of racism, which reflected recognizing and acknowledging the existence and severity of racism, as well as expressing concerns for racism-related issues. And this dimension was assessed using items such as real racism is a thing of the past. Now, all of these items really dealt with minimizing racism, but were recoded to fit the direction of the other belief dimensions. The third belief dimension that came out of the factor analysis was internal-external attributions for racism, which reflects a tendency to sort of perceive racism as structural and the result of external factors rather than just isolated interpersonal events or internal factors. And this dimension was primarily assessed using a bipolar question, where participants were given a statement such as, on average, Black students score lower on standardized tests than white students do. Why is this? And they were provided with two answer choices that were designed to reflect more internal interpersonal aspects versus external structural ones. And participants were asked to just move the slider in the direction of the answer that best fit their beliefs. For the fourth belief dimension, this was contemporary knowledge of racial movements and reflected beliefs around recent social political movements such as Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter being either for or against racial justice for Black people and Black liberation. And this dimension was also assessed using these bipolar slider questions similar to the previous dimension, but this time individuals were given a movement and answers that were designed in light of public discourse around these movements and the two salient stances that were coming up regarding the movement in popular discourse. The last belief dimension was duty to know about racism. And this reflected the degree to which individuals sort of felt an obligation and or a duty to know or be informed about racial inequity and discrimination. And these items were a lot more face valid, right? So it's my duty to be informed about race discrimination. So in addition to those items that I created, I also included established measures that are associated with beliefs about racism and social inequities. So specifically symbolic racism, which I discussed a little bit earlier, as well as critical consciousness. Now, turning to our focal outcome measures. In order to assess perceptions of racism, I gave people scenarios where they had to indicate whether incidents of isolated and structural racial bias were indicative of racism or not. And this included items such as a car salesman offers lower prices to white customers than non-white customers, and a city adopts zoning ordinances that prohibit low-income and multifamily households in predominantly white communities. I also assessed individuals' engagement in anti-racist activism in the last 6 months prior to completing the survey. So participants were given a total of 10 different items, such as whether or not they had displayed a poster, or button, or a sticker with the message against racism, donated money to an organization that is fighting racism, participate in a protest against racism, or raised awareness by talking to people directly or posting on social media around issues of race and racism. And they were just asked to indicate yes or no as to whether or not they had participated in any of these actions. Notably, our participants weren't very active, right? So sort of averaging 2 behaviors out of a total of 10. So the first research question guiding the study was, do Black and white Americans have a belief system around anti-Black racism? And the short answer is yes, but what does this look like? So to orient you to the graph, on the y-axis, this was really sort of the degree of agreeability that individuals had around beliefs about anti-Black racism. And so these Likert items were sort of recoded to range from -1 to 1, so that we can combine both those Likert items with those bipolar slider items. And values that are negative would really sort of suggest essentially not believing that anti-Black racism exists, whereas positive values would suggest believing that anti-Black racism exists. And I'm going to present the adjusted means and standard errors after controlling for gender, income, education, and political orientation. So both Black and white participants were likely to believe that racism was endemic, although this was larger among our Black participants compared to our white participants. We did not observe a significant racial ethnic group differences in terms of this non-minimization of racism. Black participants were also more likely to attribute racism to external versus internal factors. But as you can see here, both Black and white participants had this tendency to attribute it to external factors versus internal factors. Internal factors would have been in the negative values versus the positive values. It was also the case that Black participants had greater knowledge around racial movements compared to white participants. And I do want to note that for white participants, this looks like it's practically zero, but it was significantly different from zero. And last but not least, both our Black and white participants expressed a duty to know about racism or feeling an obligation to know about racism. Again, this tendency was stronger for our Black participants compared to our white participants. Now, how does this belief system help us to understand perceptions of racism and engagement in anti-racist action? More so, does this belief system help us in addition to or even beyond previous measures of symbolic racism and critical consciousness? So in order to test this, I looked at how much additional variance my belief dimensions around anti-Black racism explain perceptions of racism and engagement in anti-racist activism after accounting for demographic characteristics, as well as symbolic racism and critical consciousness. So in terms of perceptions of isolated racism, after accounting for demographic characteristics such as race, age, gender, income, education, and political orientation, both symbolic racism and critical consciousness predicted perceptions of isolated racism in the anticipated way. So the more symbolic racism that participants had, the less likely they were to perceive isolated racism, and the more critical consciousness that our participants had, the more likely they were to perceive isolated racism. And when we add in the dimensions around critical anti-Black racism awareness, or those belief dimensions, we see an increase in the variance explained for the tendency to perceive racism and isolated incidents involving racial bias. But what are these various belief dimensions doing? Well, while symbolic racism continues to be a significant predictor in the way we'd expect, critical consciousness no longer is. Neither are my dimensions around internal-external attributions for racism, nor contemporary knowledge of racial movements. However, believing that racism is endemic, not minimizing racism, and expressing a duty to know about racism all predicted the tendency to perceive isolated incidents of racial bias as being indicative of racism. Turning to perceptions of structural racism, again, after accounting for demographic characteristics, symbolic racism and critical consciousness predicted perceptions of structural racism in the anticipated way. And again, when we add in the dimensions around critical anti-Black racism awareness, we see an increase in the variance explained for the tendency to perceive racism in structural incidents involving racial bias. Now, with the inclusion of my belief dimensions, symbolic racism nor critical consciousness continue to be significant predictors in the way we'd expect. Neither are my dimensions around non-minimization of racism, nor contemporary knowledge of racial movements. However, again, believing that racism is endemic, expressing a duty to know about racism, as well as believing that racism is attributable to external over internal factors, predicted the tendency to perceive structural incidents of racial bias as being indicative of racism. And last but not least, turning to engagement in anti-racist activism, now after accounting for demographic characteristics, only critical consciousness predicted engagement in anti-racist activism. Symbolic racism did not. And when we add in my belief dimensions, again, we see this increase in the variance explained for this tendency to engage in anti-racist activism. And this is driven by my dimensions around racism as endemic, having contemporary knowledge of racial movements, and expressing this duty to know about racism. So what we can gather from this study is that both Black and white Americans have a complex belief system around anti-Black racism. And this belief system leans more towards believing that racism is endemic, acknowledging its existence, seeing racism as being the product of structural and systemic factors over interpersonal and dispositional ones, understanding the meaning behind movements that either are for or against Black lives and the liberation of Black people, and feeling a duty and obligation to know about racism. And these beliefs were generally stronger for Black participants compared to white participants. However, for both Black and white participants, elements of this belief system consistently predicted perceptions of isolated and structural racism, as well as engagement in anti-racist activism beyond these previous measures of symbolic racism and critical consciousness. And of these dimensions around critical anti-Black racism awareness, racism as endemic consistently was a driving force, which makes sense given that this dimension really reflects seeing the connections between past and present racism, believing that racism is historically rooted and entrenched in US society. And so what this measure is really tapping into is the ways in which people believe racism to be or not to be. That racism is not just interpersonal, it's structural. That racism is not just happening in the present or in the past, but that there is a connection between past and present racism, and that racism is prevalent, severe, and systemic. Now, again, I did not manipulate individuals' awareness of or their knowledge about anti-Black racism. This critical racism awareness is really reflecting the pre-existing knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs that individuals have surrounding anti-Black racism. And in this way, it's sort of serving as a schema, or even more so, a worldview. And if it is a worldview, I wanted to understand how does a worldview around anti-Black racism influence subjective beliefs about racism and objective facts, namely the history of anti-Black racism in the US. But first, I'm curious what you all know about the history of anti-Black racism. Now, don't worry, I don't expect you all to come off of mute to yell out the answers. I really just want to present some of the questions that were surveyed among high school seniors from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So take a moment to look at these two questions and think about what you believe the correct answers to be. Okay, mental pencils down. So for this first question, the correct answer was the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. And now only 59% of high school seniors got this question correct. And for the second question, the correct answer was enslaved people who escaped captivity. And only 46% of high school seniors surveyed got this question, 46 got this question incorrect. And perhaps some of you did as well, and that's completely okay. Now, my third question to you would be whether or not one needs to have gotten these questions correct to understand how, for instance, slavery and Jim Crow continue to affect the lives of Black people today. And I would suggest not necessarily. So while previous research demonstrates that factual accuracy about historical anti-Black racism increases perceptions of present-day racism, I suggest that having a worldview around anti-Black racism is another tool that can be used towards understanding patterns in perceiving present-day incidents of racism and racial bias. And so while these two processes should be related, I'd argue that they reflect two different processes. Now, yes, part of having a worldview around anti-Black racism involves having some understanding of history. However, critical racism awareness is less about having factual knowledge and is more so about having an in-depth understanding of anti-Black racism as rooted in history and being able to see patterns in the perpetuation of this racism. So in this last study that I'm going to talk to you all about, what I wanted to do was examine the relationship between critical racism awareness and factual knowledge about objective anti-Black racism. Specifically, I explored whether there was a linear relationship between these two constructs, whether or not this belief system sort of contributed to predictions of present day, the perceptions of present day racism, and whether critical racism awareness is associated with biases in how people come to recollect the history of racism in the US. So for this study, I recruited just over 600 Black and non-Hispanic white participants from qualitative research panels. About half of them identified as Black African American and reported being more Democratic or liberal leaning than not. So participants completed a true/false Black history quiz about anti-Black racism and were given items such as the violence Black and minorities experienced after the Civil War by white mobs when they were elected into Southern governing bodies, and they were asked to indicate whether the item was true or false. In this case, this item was true, as well as items such as the Black codes allowing freed African American men the right to vote if their fathers had been able to vote before the Civil War, which in this case was a false item. And we also assessed individuals' anti-Black racism, that sort of worldview, using the racism as endemic dimension from that critical racism awareness scale. And again, we gave people scenarios where they had to indicate whether incidents involving racial bias, both isolated and structural, were indicative of racism or not. However, these items were different from those in the previous study, And I'd argue that these items were a little bit more complex and signal anti-Black racism a bit more directly. So for instance, with this isolated item, this included incidents such as a woman with a stereotypical white name being called back for an interview while a woman with a stereotypical Black name does not, although the qualifications were about the same. And for the structural items, this included statements such as that really sort of speak to sort of racialized sentencing practices, right? So bias at this more structural level. So here, there's a bias in harsher treatment for the sentencing of crack, which is stereotypically associated with Black people, compared to cocaine, which is stereotypically linked to white people. So first, what I found was that there was a significant association between having a worldview around anti-Black racism, namely that racism is endemic, and sort of demonstrating having factual accuracy on that Black history quiz. And that really being the ability to sort of determine true incidents of racism as true and false incidents of racism as false. So the primary research question here was, how does this belief system help us to understand perceptions of racism in comparison to knowledge of objective facts? So to answer this, I did something very similar to what I did in the previous study that I went over with you all. So I looked at how this dimension around racism being endemic explained perceptions of racism after accounting for race and political orientation, as well as having factual accuracy on the Black history quiz. So in terms of isolated racism, after accounting for race and political orientation, having factual knowledge regarding the history of anti-Black racism in the US was predictive of perceiving racism and isolated incidents involving racial bias. And when I added my critical racism awareness measure as a predictor, a significant amount of additional variance is explained, and holding this worldview ended up being a stronger predictor, as you can see from the 95% confidence intervals. In terms of structural racism, again, after accounting for participants' race and political orientation, having factual knowledge regarding the history of anti-Black racism in the US was predictive of perceiving racism and structural incidents involving racial bias. And when I added in this critical racism awareness as a predictor, again, a significant amount of additional variance was explained, and holding this worldview was a stronger predictor, as you can see from not only the 95% confidence intervals, but factual accuracy no longer was a significant predictor. Moreover, having this worldview was associated with response biases on the Black history quiz. Specifically, greater beliefs around anti-Black racism predicted a bias towards responding true on this Black history quiz. But who has this bias? So I calculated a bias measure using signal detection theory. And so just to orient you to the y-axis, this value was able to range from -1 to 1, with negative values sort of signifying a bias towards responding true on this Black history quiz, so a bias towards sort of really seeing racism, whereas a positive value indicated a bias towards responding false, so not seeing racism on this Black history quiz. And what we can see here is that both Black and white participants have a bias towards responding true, but this tendency was greater among our Black participants compared to our white participants. So to summarize the main takeaways, having a worldview around anti-Black racism is associated with having greater factual accuracy around objective instances of historical anti-Black racism. And factual knowledge and this worldview both predicted one's tendency to perceive racism incidents involving racial bias, which suggests that while knowledge, of course, helps us to understand individuals' perceptions of racism, so does having this worldview. So much so that critical racism awareness does to a greater degree. So having a belief system around racism being endemic, historically rooted, and linked to the present is also important to consider when attempting to understand perceptions of racism. Moreover, it was also the case that this worldview around anti-Black racism was associated with a bias towards believing that a lot more anti-Black racism occurred throughout our history versus not, which was reflected in that bias measure in responding true versus false on that quiz. And while this tendency was greater among Black Americans, the results from our study suggest that both Black and white Americans err on the side of the US having a lot more anti-Black racism in its history than not. And this might suggest that something more is happening here than Black Americans simply being hypersensitive or hypervigilant to racism. So my work suggests that both Black and white Americans have a complex belief system around anti-Black racism, And the implications of having this worldview are twofold. On the one hand, having such a worldview can predict the tendency to perceive racism in both isolated and structural incidents involving racial bias. It can predict the tendency to engage in anti-racist activism. And it can also help us to understand biases in the ways that people think about the objective reality of racism in the US, namely the history of anti-Black racism. But on the other hand, for Black Americans in particular, having such a worldview may also be disempowering and can be associated with cautionary beliefs and attitudes and behaviors, such as having race-based medical mistrust, which we know that having more of can contribute to poorer health outcomes among Black Americans. And testing this relationship between having a worldview around anti-Black racism and health outcomes among Black Americans directly is some of the work that I'm working on now. So when we talk about the history of racism in America, both presently as well as in the past, we tend to talk about these facts as if it's just a matter of whether or not people know that these things are true, but it doesn't really get us very far. Because people can know about the Tuskegee experiment and not see how this has contributed to factors such as medical mistrust, which plays an important role in understanding why Black people have a shorter life expectancy compared to white people. And they can know about slavery and Jim Crow, and yet not see how it is connected to present-day wealth gaps. So we're missing a critical step in understanding how people sort of approach and perceive issues around race and racism. We don't want people to just be able to say, yep, racism exists or it existed. We want them to see and recognize the linkage between patterns and the similarities between past and present forms of racial oppression and how it continues to be perpetuated and maintained today. And I believe that understanding people's worldview around racism is a first step towards doing this. And with that, I'd like to thank my PhD advisors, as well as my postdoc advisors and my collaborators who really help with these projects, my funding sources, and you all for listening. Thank you.